Welcome to that second meeting and video teaching under the headline Our Wonderful Bible. And today we would like to have a look to the Old Testament, and I would like to start reading a verse in Luke chapter 24 and verse 32. And they, the two disciples, said to one another, "Was not our heart burning in us as he spoke to us on the way and as he opened the scriptures to us?" The context makes it clear that here it is a question of the Old Testament. The scriptures here, that is the Old Testament. Now we know the Bible has these two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And maybe you remember last time we have already said that the Old Testament deals with God's earthly people and with God's earthly projects, the counsel of God for this earth. The Old Testament, with its 39 books, has over 20 different authors. It was mostly written in the Hebrew language, and it covers a total period of around 4,000 years, starting with the creation of heaven and earth and ending with that remnant of Israel who returned from the Babylonian captivity. The Old Testament was written between 1400 before Christ and roughly 450 before Christ, so within a period of nearly 1,000 years. The Jews divide this book, divide the Old Testament into three parts. These three parts are called the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. The Law, these are the 5 books of Moses. The Prophets include also the so-called historical books and the prophets. And the Writings are the books like Psalms, Proverbs, Ezra, and Nehemiah. In our modern Bibles, we normally have 4 parts in the Old Testament. First part, again, the 5 books of Moses, called the Law. Then secondly, we have the so-called historical books. The first is the book of Joshua and the last is the book of Esther. And then we have thirdly the poetic books, Job, Psalms, until the Song of Songs. And fourthly, we have the prophets, and normally we divide again between, or we distinguish between the major prophets and the minor prophets. Those who have written long books, the major prophets, and those who have written comparatively small books, the so-called minor prophets. Now, what is the Old Testament about? Now, it's difficult, of course, in 2 minutes to speak about the contents of the Old Testament, but let me try to do it very briefly. The Old Testament, first of all, starts with Genesis, and in the first 11 chapters, we get the first 2,000 years of history of man, starting with creation and ending with Noah's sons. Then in Genesis 12 to 15, we get the roots or the origin of Israel, the history of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And then from Exodus to the end of the Old Testament, you have the history of the earthly people of Israel, covering another 2,000 years. So you have book of Genesis, 2,000 years. and then you have Exodus to the last book of the Old Testament, another roughly 2,000 years. That makes in total 4,000 years before Jesus Christ was born. Now the history of Israel can be divided into 7 parts. First of all, you have Israel in bondage in Egypt. Then secondly, you have Israel in the desert under God's guidance. Thirdly, you have Israel in the land under Joshua and the judges. Then fourthly, you have Israel as a united kingdom under their 3 first kings, Saul, David and Solomon. Then you have fifthly the divided kingdom, the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and the 10 tribes. Then you have sixthly the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And then the 7 and the last section is after the captivity, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the last prophets you get in the Old Testament. Now, why do we read the Old Testament? We are Christians. We find our blessings in the New Testament. But why do we read the Old Testament? Why did the Lord Jesus Christ open the eyes of the disciples to understand the Old Testament? Dear friends, the Old Testament is important for us. It's part of the holy inspired book of God, so we should also read the Old Testament. You get, first of all, historical teaching in the Old Testament. Historical teaching, but from a divine viewpoint. Secondly, you get a lot of prophetic teaching in the Old Testament about Israel's future in the millennium, about Christ's future when he will be accepted as Lord of Lords and King of Kings and reigning in his wonderful kingdom of justice, of peace and of righteousness. But thirdly, you get a lot of practical teaching in the Old Testament. And I would just like to draw your attention to a verse in Romans chapter 15, which is very important in this context. Romans 15 verse 5, it says, "For as many things as have been written before," that means in the Old Testament, "have been written for our instruction, that through endurance and through encouragement of the Scriptures," Old Testament, "we might have hope." This makes it very clear the Old Testament is given for our practical teaching. And let me turn to another verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. "But these things happened," the things to Israel happened as types for us, that we should not be lusters after evil things. And then again in verse 11, "Now all these things happened to them," people in the Old Testament, "as types, and have been written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages are come." So we have a lot of practical teaching in the Old Testament for our personal life, for our married life, for our family life, for our assembly life. You get examples in the Old Testament, positive examples, steps that we should follow, but also negative examples for our admonition, and we should not follow them. So the Old Testament illustrates a lot of practical matters that are worked out in the New Testament. The fourth reason why we should read the Old Testament is that in the Old Testament we get a lot of illustration of New Testament truth. We have read about types. There is a figurative language in the Old Testament in order to help us to better understand the Christian doctrine. I just give one example. The book of Exodus explains us the whole plan of God's salvation. Redemption by blood, redemption by power. That is clearly illustrated in the book of Exodus. But there is a fifth reason why we should read the Old Testament, and that is the climax. Why? The Old Testament speaks of Christ. I would just read from John chapter 5, where the Lord Jesus himself says in John 5, verse 39, "Ye search the Scriptures, and for ye think that in them ye have life eternal. And they it is which bear witness concerning me." The Old Testament gives testimony, bears witness of Christ. And to these two disciples who were going to Emmaus, the Lord Jesus Christ explained them everything in the Scriptures concerning him. Peter speaks about the Old Testament prophets speaking about the sufferings of Christ and the glories hereafter. So in the Old Testament we find Christ. You get direct prophecies, like Isaiah 53, a direct prophecy as to Christ. We get a lot of types concerning Christ. Take an example, Joseph. The great teaching of Joseph's history is through sufferings to glory. That is the way Christ went, through sufferings to glory. Then thirdly, you have all these different sacrifices in the Old Testament, starting from the first animal that was killed by God himself in order to give clothes to Adam and Eve. And then you have this great number of sacrifices that were brought in the Old Testament times. And they all focus on that one offering of Christ on the cross of Calvary, where he gave his life. And fourthly, you have certain incidences in the Old Testament that speak of Christ. For example, the killing of the Passover lamb in Exodus 12, the crossing of the Red Sea, the crossing of the Jordan. All these speaks of Christ. The Old Testament is full of Christ, and that is the greatest use why we should read the Old Testament. I would encourage you to not negligate the Old Testament. Read it. Try to find out what is the practical impact and what does it say about Christ. It is a wonderful thing to study the Old Testament.